thank you all for your practice. So for the past few weeks, we've been going over the Satipatthana Sutta. The Satipatthana is from the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the medium-length discourses. It's Majjhima Nikaya 10. So if you wanted to look this sutta up, you could easily go Google Buddhism and MJ10 and pretty easily find this sutta. It is the Buddha's discourse on the establishment of the four foundations of mindfulness. And what I've been doing is kind of teasing this apart for the past few weeks. So we started with an overview of the sutta, and the first week we went into breath, and the second week we covered postures. And that leads us to what we're covering this week, which is mindfulness of bodily activities, or really it's mindfulness of clear comprehension, or Sampajanna. The Buddha once said that the past should not be followed after, and the future not desired. What is past is dead and gone, and the future is yet to come. But whoever is intent on the present experience of developing the Eightfold Noble Path, on the practice of mindfulness of activities, on the cultivation of Sampajanna, such a one is one who is heedful, with an unshakable heart. And these words kind of guide us towards the heart of mindfulness practice. And just being fully present in the present moment and recognizing the significance of the way that our actions impact ourselves and impact others. It's a practice that extends to the most mundane aspects of life. And as we walk, we know that we're walking. As we sit, we know that we're sitting. As we eat, we know we're eating, etc. You get the idea. And so this word Sampajanna is a word that you don't really hear too much. It's often accompanied with the word sati. And sati is at the core of this sutta and at the core of this practice. Sati translates as mindfulness or remembrance, so to remember. And so it has this quality of recollection to it, just remembering where we are and what we're doing. Sampajanna translates more into clear comprehension or clear knowing. And it's derived from the verb janya, which means to know or to understand. So anytime in this practice, anytime you see a Pali term that ends with the letters N-N-A, nya, it means to know. So with panya, meaning wisdom, it's seeing wisdom clearly. Sampajanna, again, is just clear comprehension. So we get the prefix of sam, and if you are familiar with the Eightfold Path, every factor of the path starts with sama. It's often translated as right, which is not a very good translation. What it really means is something more like complete or whole. So Sampajanna is the mental process by which we continually monitor our minds using all five spiritual faculties. And that's confidence, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And we want all of those to be in balance. And there are four ways of training in Sampajanna that the Buddha spoke of pretty often. And the point of Sampajanna is for the establishment of appamada. Appamada is essentially heedfulness. So mindfulness goes a long way in knowing where we're at and what we're doing, but with Sampajanna, we're getting into the quality of what we're doing and how it affects ourselves and how it affects others. And so tonight I'd like to talk about mindfulness of activities. I'd like to talk about what mindfulness of activities actually means and the four ways that we are to train the mind in Sampajanna. So mindfulness of activities is like sculpting wood with the precision of a master craftsman. Each movement is deliberate and very precise. As the Satipatthana Sutta instructs, I'm going to read some of the sutta. It says, in this way, he remains focused internally on the body in and of itself, or externally on the body in and of itself, or both internally and externally on the body in and of itself. Or he remains focused on the phenomenon of origination with regard to the body, on the phenomenon of passing away with regard to the body, or on the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regard to the body. But the Buddha didn't stop there. This is where we kind of get introduced to this idea of Sampajanna, or clear comprehension, and it's kind of like the guiding star for this practice. So It's the discerning wisdom that enables us to see clearly the purposes and consequences of our actions. As we engage in our daily activities, we ask ourselves, why am I doing this? What is the outcome? Is it beneficial or is it harmful for myself and for others? And the Buddha emphasized this aspect in the Satipatthana Sutta as well, when he said, and how does a monk remain focused on the body in and of itself? Just as when a cloth is fastened to a peg, the thought occurs, the cloth is fastened to the peg. In the same way, when a monk remains focused on the body in and of itself, the thought occurs, the body is in and of itself. And so how can we train ourselves in this practice? Well, we begin by observing the breath, as we have found out over the past couple of weeks. And because the breath is a universal anchor for mindfulness. It's not hard to find. It's the easiest anchor that's available to us. We're always breathing. We're always paying attention to something. So when we're practicing anapanasati or mindfulness of breathing, it's the easiest way to do that. It's just right there. It's readily made for us to pay attention to. Again, we're always paying attention to something. We're always breathing. So with mindfulness of breathing, we're just giving our attention to the breath. And the Buddha said that anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, if developed and cultivated, fulfills the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And we gradually extend ourselves from mindfulness of breathing into mindfulness of postures and then mindfulness to our daily activities. Whether it's eating, dressing, or even speaking, we infuse each action with awareness. Thich Nhat Hanh just beautifully described this practice as to wash the dishes is to wash the dishes. The idea that I am washing the dishes is an abstraction. To be real, to be mindful, is to be present with all that we do in every moment. And so the first training in Sampajanna is the investigation of our motives behind our actions. Why are we doing what we're doing? And to what end are we taking part in what we're doing? John Kabat-Zinn reminds us of the transformative powers of mindfulness when he said, mindfulness is about being fully awake in our lives. It's about perceiving the exquisite vividness of each moment. So with mindfulness, we can begin turning the lens on our motives. And this is where Sampajanna comes in. The why are we doing what we're doing? And with a fairly small amount of investigation, we can really get to the core of why we're doing what we're doing. So we're looking at whether our motivations are skillful or unskillful, whether they're wholesome or unwholesome. We ask ourselves, is it to the benefit of ourselves? Or is it to the benefit of others? Or is it to the benefit of both? A good example of this is my motivations for making the decision to go into business for myself, right? So I could say, I'm doing this to make more money. But am I really doing it to make more money, or am I doing it because I don't like answering to anybody else? Probably a little of both. Am I doing this to make more money, or am I doing this because I want to have more time? Probably a little of both. So it's this investigation of our motives behind things. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? And clear comprehension is also very helpful when we're dealing with our frequently visiting friend Mara. Mara is the demon of impermanence. He is the lord of the heavens and the underworld. He's kind of like king shit of the Dharma. He is the Buddha's nemesis, if the Buddha was to have a nemesis, but I don't think it would be very Buddhist of the Buddha to have a nemesis. But Mara is the embodiment of our own delusions and the embodiment of what is known as the 5 hindrances. Mara is essentially the tempter, right? Mara shows up as greed when we want that second bowl of ice cream. Mara shows up as aversion when we react with anger to a situation rather than accepting it as it is. And if we pay close attention, we can see that Mara shows up in much more subtle ways. Joseph Goldstein points out that Mara, or the hindrances, can masquerade as friends as well. And he uses the example of sloth and torpor masquerading as compassion. And he says this in his book, Mindfulness. He says, we might be feeling tired or frustrated, and this voice shows up in the mind as, I've done enough. I've been working really hard. Let me take a little rest. And sometimes we do need to rest. Sometimes absolutely we need to rest. But sometimes it's just the aspect of that voice of sloth and torpor that just retreats from difficulties. So if we really investigate our actions and our motives, we can really see what's going on underneath the surface. Mike taught me, to use the phrase, I see you, Mara, right? And that kind of helps us from unhooking from this seductive quality of the mind. Once we notice it and we're aware of it, it's like, I see you, Mara, right? And I say that to myself pretty constantly. Maybe not as much as I should, but pretty constantly. And so it's this aspect of clear comprehension and seeing whether our actions are of benefit or not. It relies on the understanding of the ethical dimension of mindfulness. So it really brings into light our sila, or our ethics. And this is the clear discernment of how we act in the world. The second way in which we are asked to train in Sampajanna is the sustainability of our actions. With this training, we begin an even further investigation of our actions. Because even if an act is wholesome, we have to examine whether it is the time and the place for that action. And the Buddha highlights this in his teaching on right speech, or samavaka, when he asks us to use the qualifiers of, is it true? Is it useful? Is it timely? And is it kind? Because often it may be true, and it may be useful, and it may be kind, but it's just not the right time to say the thing, right? So we want to make sure that our actions are sustainable. And on my best days, when I'm being mindful, I use these filters a good portion of the time. On my best days, on my worst days, absolutely not. And I'm pretty terrible with it. But we all have our good days and our bad days. But the encouragement is to do this with all of our actions. Are they sustainable? And will continuing in the way that we are acting be of detriment to others or to ourselves? The third field of practice in the training of Sampajanna is knowing the fields of practice in which we're to train. So it's knowing the proper fields to practice mindfulness. And we're really fortunate that the Buddha told us exactly and very succinctly what these fields for practice are in the establishment of mindfulness. These are the establishment of mindfulness of the breath and body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of the mind, and mindfulness of categories of experience, or dhammas. And so, again, we're bringing this level of mindfulness to every aspect of our experience. The fourth way in which we are to train in Sampajanna, according to the Buddha, is understanding non-delusion. And at the core of non-delusion is seeing clearly the three characteristics of all existent phenomena. This is the impermanent, unsatisfactory, impersonal nature of our existence. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. And non-delusion understands that in the scope of all bodily actions, that there is no one doing anything. There's doing, but without a doer. And the concept of anatta, or not self, can be difficult to understand at first, and it's probably one of the least understood concepts in the Dharma. It doesn't mean that there is no self. We're obviously here, we exist, but what it really means is there is no lasting self. There is no fixed self. And that is due to the impermanent nature of all existent phenomena. So what we define as the self is really just the coalescence of what is known as the five aggregates. And this is the mind and body, consciousness, feeling, perception, and mental formations. These are essentially the things that come together to make a person a person. But because all of these things are constantly changing, there can be no fixed self. And that's where we get this teaching of anatta, or not self. And due to the fact that there is no permanence to be found, again, there's just no fixed self. We exist, but we are ever changing. Our thoughts are changing, our emotions are changing, our bodies are constantly changing, our experience is constantly changing. Everything about us is always changing. So in that, there can be no fixed self. And there's a story of the Buddha. It's called The Empty Chariot. And once the Buddha addressed his disciples, and he said, "Consider a chariot, my dear monks. Is the axle the chariot?" And the monks replied, "No, Lord." He continued, "Is the pole the chariot?" Again, they replied, "No, Lord." The Buddha then asked about other various parts of the chariot, such as the wheels, the reins, and the yoke. And each time the monks replied, "No, Lord." So the Buddha concluded that just as a chariot is not the sum of its parts, but a temporary arrangement of components, so too is the self. It is not found within the body or mind, but is a concept created by the interaction of physical and mental elements. And so this story illustrates that, like the chariot, the self is a convention. It's a mental construct arising from the interplay of various elements, essentially. There is no permanent, unchanging self to be found. And it's this view of a permanent or unchanging self that causes an awful lot of our suffering, if we're being really honest. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is the Buddha's discourse on the Four Noble Truths, and if you want to look that one up, it's Samyutta Nikaya 5611, actually, if we're being really technical. But we learn about the different forms of dukkha, or stress, or suffering, however you choose to translate dukkha, because there's many different translations for it. And in that sutta it says, "Now this, monks, is the noble truth of stress. Birth is stressful, aging is stressful, death is stressful, sorrow, lamentation, pain, and distress and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not getting what we want is stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful." So anytime we identify as me, I, mine, any of that, once we get the self involved, we're setting ourselves up for suffering. And that's certainly true for me. I can think most of the suffering that I experience, especially mental suffering. I mean, physical suffering is going to be kind of unavoidable. But as far as like sankhara dukkha, the stress created by our own minds, it all comes from this identification with a fixed permanent self. You know, once we stop putting the lens on ourselves and we start thinking about other people, we stop suffering a lot. So yeah, clinging to the 5 aggregates of self is not going to get you very far. And you know, every time I get caught up in self-referential thought, it has the effect of my own suffering, pretty much every time. You know, so once we lose the I, we lose the me, we lose the mind, we lose a whole lot of suffering. And after that particular refrain in that sutta, the Buddha encourages us to practice internally and externally. And again, mindfulness of ourselves, Sampajanna of ourselves and of others. So we're always contemplating internally and always contemplating externally. And so what I'm trying to do here with this group and in general is to just kind of demystify this practice a bit. You know, to just translate things in a way that the concepts are a little more easily understood. And so I hope that this talk has given some light on mindfulness of activities and Sampajanna and how we monitor the quality of our actions when we go about in the world. I've talked about, you know, investigating our motives for action, whether that action is sustainable, the fields of practice in which we're to train, and the understanding of non-delusion through the understanding of the concept of not-self. So we're going to sit with that for a little while. We're going to do some more practice. We'll move into a longer practice this time. We'll go for about 20 minutes. And then I'd like to open it up for some discussion after that. So.